Hello and welcome to Wider View from Brussels. My name is Marcin Zaborowski. Today we will discuss one of the most momentous decisions in the entire history of the European Union, which is the accession of Ukraine to the EU. This is for the first time that the European Union might be joined by a country which is engaged in a full-scale war, in a full-scale defense of its territory. So this is obviously historically an unprecedented situation. We will be joined shortly by two Brussels experts. Before we do that, let's have a look at a feature.
After the end of the Cold War, the European Union opened a new chapter in its history, launching a long and demanding process of enlargement to the east. Candidate countries from Central and Eastern Europe faced not only a political transformation, but also the need to adopt thousands of pages of EU law and meet strict economic and democratic standards. Throughout the 1990s, governments in the region gradually applied for membership, opening negotiations with Brussels. These talks exposed the most difficult aspects of enlargement, reforming agriculture, restructuring heavy industry, protecting new external borders, and convincing public opinion in existing member states that the Union could absorb so many new countries at once. The breakthrough came in 2004 when 10 states, including Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia and the Baltic countries joined the EU in the largest enlargement in the Union's history. It was both a political success and a massive stress test for institutions in Brussels, which had to integrate new members into decision-making, cohesion policy and the single market almost overnight. Today, as Ukraine follows its own path towards the European Union, many of these questions return. Like the countries that joined in 2004, Ukraine must reform its institutions, strengthen the rule of law and adapt its economy to EU rules. But one key difference is that Kiev is pursuing ascension during a full-scale war and tremendous problems with corruption, which turns enlargement into not only an economic and political project, but also a strategic security issue for the entire continent.
Hello, joining us here in the studio are two distinguished guests, Rosa Balfour, who is the director of Carnegie Foundation Europe, and Roland Frondestein, who is the founder of Brussels Hub and the former research director at Martin Center, if I'm not mistaken, Roland, and the former director of the Adenauer Foundation office in Warsaw. And many other places, I believe. So these are two people who are extremely qualified to talk about what Brussels thinks about Ukraine and what are the bumps on the road to have this accession rolling. And to start with, I wanted to put the question to both of you about whether the war that is going on, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is it making does it strengthen the case for Ukraine's accession to the European Union, or it actually weakens that? Rosa, I would like to start with you.
Yes, it's definitely down to the war. Ukraine didn't really have an accession prospect before the war, and the enlargement process that the EU had unrolled for the Western Balkans had actually been languishing for a long time. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine really triggered a new momentum for the enlargement process that addresses both the Western Balkans and the countries that had lost the hope to join, but also Ukraine, Moldova, and in theory Georgia, except Georgia has expressed its lack of interest in joining the European Union. So this is definitely a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Roland?
I agree. How could I disagree? And I would say, I would go even one step further and say Ukraine and the outcome of the current Russian war of aggression in Ukraine will determine Europe's and the EU's future to a very large degree. If it goes wrong, if Putin triumphs and Ukraine becomes severely destabilized, the EU will be in trouble. If Ukraine continues to exist as a free country with a rule of law and with a robust military force, I think it will be a plus for the European Union to have them inside.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about this sort of nagging question that a lot of people are saying that it's all about geopolitics. That Ukraine does not really fulfill the criteria, is not ready, is too poor, is not really fitting into the European club, so to speak. Yeah? Do you, Rosa, agree that it's about that it's true that Ukraine does not really fulfill the membership criteria?
So, I mean, for looking at it from the Brussels perspective, certainly geopolitics is it provides a compelling rationale to move forward on the enlargement agenda. But if the enlargement agenda does not move forward in line with Brussels-based principles, it's going to fail. So you need to do both at the same time. You need to have the sort of technocratic rule of law approach and make sure that countries are prepared to join, but you also need to have the geopolitical logic. And to be honest, enlargement has always been a geopolitical question. When Poland and Central European countries joined, this was very much about, strengthening and expanding the European integration project. And that's what the next round will be, albeit in a far more hostile context. Obviously, in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the context was very favorable to the accession of the Central European countries and beyond. So the two need to go hand in hand, otherwise the whole European integration project will fail. The challenge is that time is of the essence, that the European Union, by and large, has been much more reluctant to enlarge and has been much more reluctant to take on the costs and benefits of enlargement. So, the debate really needs to look at what the obstacles are, but also what the benefits are and what Ukraine can bring to the table.
Roland, you witnessed Poland's accession to the EU, and you are also familiar with other countries from Central and Eastern Europe. So, do you agree that this criteria is sort of really more subjective than it's led to believe? Yeah. Do you think that Poland did fully fulfill the criteria when it was put on a path to membership, or not quite so?
Okay, as Rosa said, those were slightly different times, and they made it easier. But then again, if you the more closely you remember actually the debates in Central Europe itself, and of course in the member states of the European Union at the time, it sometimes looked less clear than it looks in hindsight. And sometimes when I watch the debates today of like Polish farmers and truckers being absolutely worried about what they consider unfair competition from Ukraine in an enlarged European Union, it's a déjà vu for me. When I remember the German and the French debates, just to take two major member states of the 1990s, where the French were afraid of the Polish plumber, and the Germans were afraid for their labor market, and the Spaniards and Italians were afraid for their farmers. So, these fears of a large country joining the European Union and offering cheap services and cheap agricultural products is a major thing in all enlargement processes. And so the charming factor today is that Poland, for example, finds itself exactly on the other side, from where it was in 1999 or 2003, where at the time they were invoking the geopolitical rationale of enlarging the European Union, and they were telling the Germans and the French that stop being such petty bureaucrats and bean counting economic factors here. And now they're the ones who are insisting on, guys, we reckon that there's a geopolitical imperative to take Ukraine in, but there are a couple of concrete things that we need to talk about.
That's fair enough, really. I wanted to ask about, I believe, sort of a controversial issue in the Ukrainian context and beyond. I mean, about corruption in Ukraine. I mean, those who oppose Ukraine's EU membership, or those who are skeptical about Ukraine, or those who don't want to help it too much, like President Trump, for example, they always say it's a very corrupt country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Europeans also have been saying that. And, you know, before Russia invaded Ukraine, corruption was one of the reasons for which the European Union was holding Ukraine, which had a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union already, but it was holding it at a distance. Corruption and the role of oligarchs in the Ukrainian economy and in Ukrainian politics, which is now, because of the war, is kind of a little bit on the back burner, but we don't know in case of a ceasefire how that will play out. There's one thing I'd like to say. If you talk to Ukrainian civil society activists, they say, do not worry about corruption because we are going to keep this under check. And indeed, civil society has, been very supportive of the Zelensky government throughout the Russian invasion. But on corruption issues, they have raised their voices and the government has had to cave in. This is a very important point that, the accession process for any country requires a solid and expert civil society to monitor and to keep checks and balances on governments and on corruption and on oligarchs and so on. And Ukraine has this. And this is a real important asset. I would argue that some EU member states do not have such a strong civil society.
So before we continue, Roland wanted to add something on the corruption issue, which, as we know, is really the talk of Ukraine skeptics.
Well, just three brief things. First of all, I totally agree. Ukrainian civil society has been stellar, especially since 2014. In making Ukraine a modern Western-oriented country. That's one thing. Second, they don't mind if European institutions keep the government under a certain pressure. They actually appreciate that. And yes, of course, they will themselves ultimately take care of this, and we've seen it, how they successfully did so in July 2025. And third, I think that the chances for fighting corruption and strengthening the rule of law have become better, actually, in recent months. First of all, through this general uprising. And remember, Ukraine is at war, and yet people took to the streets and held the government responsible, and ultimately the government backtracked about the anti-corruption institutions. So that strengthened them. And the other thing is that, Andriy Yermak, the powerful head of the presidential office, who was shielding some of the worst elements in this corruption system, is gone now, and I think the chances are good that this trend continues in Ukraine.
Rosa, I wanted to ask you about the rule of law. Obviously, it's a difficult issue in the current EU member states, such as Hungary, Poland, and so on. Can we realistically expect that under the wartime condition, Ukraine will improve its rule of law measures at all?
It's fiendishly difficult to carry out the reform that actually Ukraine is carrying out whilst being at war. But that's what they're doing. Ukrainians are walking and chewing gum at the same time. Obviously, the rule of law consolidation is something that takes time, and I think there's one issue that perhaps we need to raise here, and that is the way in which the EU accession process works is that Brussels has the stick, can exercise conditions far more strongly before countries join rather than afterwards. And this is very much the story of Central Europe. We've seen that, before accession, countries such as Hungary, Poland, got top grades in terms of rule of law, and then we have seen that rule of law standards have degraded considerably in the case of Hungary. And this is something that member states actually want to avoid in the future, because what we have now is one country in particular stands out as quite completely de-aligned from the general European position on a plethora of foreign policy issues, starting from Ukraine, and that is Hungary. Hungary is blocking decisions, is blackmailing the European Union, and for the past 6 months or so, even on other foreign policy issues, the EU is coming out with statements at 26 and no longer at 27. And the rule of law question in Hungary is at the centre of this problem of strategic de-alignment from the sort of median that EU at 27 managed to achieve. And so in the future, Brussels and member states that have to ratify accession will want to avoid this. So we'll need to see what kind of system Brussels can find to make sure that rule of law is not just, implemented in terms of legislation, but also implemented in terms of practice once new countries join the European Union.
I would like to get into the Hungarian block on the enlargement process in a moment. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you, Roland, about, because you already mentioned the farmers, the Polish farmers and the Slovak farmers and, in the past, the French farmers. When we think about the common agricultural policy, that's kind of the elephant in the room when you think about practicalities of the enlargement and the implications of a very developed agricultural sector in Ukraine becoming part of the EU. The Polish farmers, the Slovak, the Hungarians are already protesting against that. Do you think that is common agriculture policy even sustainable with Ukraine being in the EU?
Look, if you ask me, even if you asked me 30 years ago, does the common agricultural policy make sense? I would have said probably not in this form. So, but I absolutely recognize the fact that agriculture for many member states plays an almost mythical role. It's tied to national identity, it's tied to the regionalism that has spread across Europe in recent decades. So it's there. It will have to be further reformed. It already has been to an extent. It will have to be further reformed. But the main factor here in the accession of Ukraine, almost like a magic formula, is exactly the same as the one in the 2000s, and that's transition periods. In other words, there will be, even after accession, an adaptation period where the subsidies for Ukrainian agriculture will be slightly less than the ones for the existing member states, or the member states of before the accession, and at the same time, market access may not be totally complete. So transition periods, I think, is going to be largely the solution here. And, this is ultimately not a decision between outside and inside for Ukraine, but it's a question of compromise.
Thank you. Rosa, I wanted to ask you about the budget and about the money. Ukraine is large and it's poor and is devastated by the war, which is still going on.
Yeah.
Can the EU even afford taking in a country in that kind of a condition? What kind of implications that would mean for the EU budget?
Yeah, I mean, the big issue is agriculture. And then the other thing, the first thing on the budget will be decided over the coming 12 to 18 months. And at the moment, the conversation is very conservative. So we should not expect that if and when Ukraine is ready to join the European Union after 2030, the financial framework will not be adequate. So we're looking at supporting Ukraine financially in a different way. And let me just highlight a few things of this different way. I mean, let's assume that a ceasefire will take place. Then there's going to be a rush of private capital, public resources for the reconstruction of Ukraine. That is really going to unleash, I think, some positive dynamics for the whole region of Central and Eastern Europe. Number two, Ukraine's defense sector and technological sector are well advanced. They are going to bump up the similar sectors in Europe, especially if there are joint projects, joint investment schemes, and this is already being discussed. Okay, the business sector is already working on this. There already are agreements between Ukraine and other governments on these factors. So, alongside the sort of static costs that we can see, and the financial framework and budgets, etc., reflect those static costs. We also have a situation of potential economic, uplifting. In case there is a ceasefire, so thanks to the end of war, venture capital is interested in this part of the world. So there are going to be some positive dynamics. And I'd like to go back to the previous the Big Bang enlargement of 2004. If you looked at the GDP, right, the gross domestic product of EU 15 versus the 10 countries that we're going to join, and then the GDP, so the gross domestic product of the EU today versus that of the various countries that are, the 9 countries that could be joining soon, the gap was much wider in the 1990s when Europeans made this big decision than today. Okay, much wider. So it was actually much more costly. And number 2, the fact that the EU enlarged actually boosted the European economy by several points of GDP in some countries, and the growth rate of the countries that joined the European Union were astonishing. So, there are positive economic benefits from enlargement that are not reflected in this sort of static view of enlargement through budgets and financial frameworks.
It's a great argument, thank you. Well, there is an elephant in the room in all of that, and this elephant in the room is called Viktor Orban. For now, Hungary has been essentially blocking the negotiations. So there is Ukraine is a candidate, the screening process has been completed, there is a nod of most of the EU Council to start the negotiations, but Hungary has been blocking it. How it can be overcome? Roland, over to you.
I think a lot of people, including myself here, are hoping for the parliamentary elections in Hungary in April this year to bring about change. In other words, that the opposition with Péter Magyar finally come to power. I would almost be tempted to say there's regime change in Budapest. That would be great, and that would certainly change a lot of things about these Hungarian vetoes. It still wouldn't be easy, because he considers himself a patriot as well in the Hungarian definition, but it would be easier than now with Orban. But the big question is, what if that doesn't happen? And we get another term in office for Viktor Orban. I think in that case, it will really be up to the other member states to exert pressure on Hungary and say, look, there are dire consequences concerning not just the EU institutions and the EU funds and Hungarian voting rights and what have you, but there actually will be bilateral pressure, economic pressure, political pressure on Hungary. Because the big mistake of the member states in past years has been to outsource the entire rule of law conflict with the Hungarian government, or let's say the consequences of Hungarian violations of rule of law principles, and they've outsourced this to the European Commission. And the European Commission is dependent on the member states in such matters. And so, this has already started to change in recent years. And I hope that this factor will become very, very predominant in case Orban remains in office. And then we will continue with Ukraine no matter what Hungary says.
Thank you, Roland. Rosa, in 1 minute, what's your take on that? Can we find some kind of a trick to outsmart the Hungarians on this?
So far, the strategy the tactics have been to try and buy off, outsmart, close a blind eye. I'm not entirely sure this is sustainable in the long term. I also think that rule of law standards in Hungary are deteriorating rapidly. So my question is, for how long are member states willing to accept that? And for how long are member states willing to accept these blockages on foreign policy? I mean, we live in a very unstable world, and the only solution for Europeans is to do more together, not less. And Orbán's policy is to try and sow divisions in Europe and make sure that the EU cannot play a global role. If that is what other European leaders want, then they'll keep him in his fold. If that's not what other European leaders want, then they need to isolate him further. And maybe activate the nuclear bomb, which is Article 7, which would suspend Hungary's rights, and so it wouldn't be able to vote any longer to block European decisions.
Let's hope for the best. Rosa, thank you. Roland, thank you very much. That's all for today. Please join us in a week. That was TVP World, broadcasting from Brussels.